The evening of March 7, 1961, settled over Las Vegas with the particular quality of early spring in the desert when the days have begun to warm, but the nights still carry enough cold to remind you that winter has not yet fully conceded. And Frank Sinatra walked through the Sands Hotel casino floor at 11 o'clock, having finished his second show of the evening, still in his performance clothes, because he had come directly from the stage without stopping at his dressing room, which was something he sometimes did when a show had left him with a particular kind of energy that needed to discharge itself through motion, rather than through sitting quietly in a room while someone removed his makeup. And the casino floor at 11 on a Tuesday was busy without being crowded. The specific middle state that the Sands reached on weeknights when the serious gamblers were still at the tables, but the peripheral crowd that gathered on weekends had thinned, and Frank Sinatra moved through it with the ease of someone who had been moving through rooms like this for long enough that the rooms had ceased to require any portion of his attention, his mind elsewhere, watching something above the level of the casino floor, without focusing on anything specific. What pulled his focus to something specific was not dramatic, was in fact so small that he almost walked past it, which was a man sitting alone at the end of the bar nearest the casino's eastern exit, not drinking from the glass in front of him, not looking at anything in the room, with the particular quality of stillness that is different from ordinary stillness. That is the stillness of someone who has run out of forward motion and is sitting in the place where forward motion stopped. The man's name was Samuel Bridges, though Frank Sinatra did not know this yet, and he was 37 years old, a trumpet player from Memphis who had been in Las Vegas for 6 days pursuing a position as a session musician with one of the Strip's house bands. A position he had been told was available through a contact in Memphis who knew someone in Las Vegas who knew someone who made hiring decisions at the Sands. And Samuel had arrived with the money he had saved over 18 months of teaching music at an elementary school in Memphis, and with a trumpet that was not the best trumpet available, but was a good one. And he had spent 6 days making contact with the person who knew the person who made hiring decisions, and had been told each time that the decision maker was unavailable. And on the 6th day, he had learned from a musician he met in a coffee shop on the Strip that the position he had come to Las Vegas for had been filled 3 weeks ago, and that the contact in Memphis who had told him it was available had either been misinformed or had been telling him something that was no longer true. And Samuel had spent the afternoon sitting in his room at a motel on Fremont Street doing the arithmetic of his situation, which was that he had spent a significant portion of his savings on the trip and the 6 days in Las Vegas, and that what remained was enough to get him home and no more, and he had come to the Sands Casino at 9 in the evening not to gamble. He could not afford to gamble, but because the alternative was continuing to sit in his motel room with the arithmetic, and he had been sitting at this bar for 2 hours with an untouched drink he had bought because you were expected to buy something if you were going to occupy a bar stool, and he was working through what he intended to do next, which at this point was nothing more specific than return to Memphis and return to the elementary school, and put 18 months of savings back into the account he had emptied, which was survivable, but which had a quality of finality to it that felt larger than its practical dimensions warranted. Frank Sinatra stood near the bar for a moment watching Samuel Bridges not drink his drink, and then walked over and sat on the stool beside him and said nothing for a moment, just sat there. And Samuel looked sideways at him with the expression people had when Frank Sinatra appeared unexpectedly in their personal space, and then looked back at his drink. And Frank Sinatra said, "What are you drinking?" And Samuel said, "Bourbon, I think." And Frank Sinatra said, "You think?" And Samuel said, "I ordered it 2 hours ago, I haven't touched it." And Frank Sinatra said, "Expensive way to occupy a bar stool." And Samuel said, "I know." And neither of them said anything for another moment. And then Frank Sinatra said, "What happened?" And Samuel looked at him again, and this time the look lasted long enough to constitute an actual exchange rather than a startle reflex. And Samuel, who was tired enough and disappointed enough that the social calculations that normally govern how much you told a stranger had ceased to function properly, told Frank Sinatra what had happened, told him about the position, and the contact in Memphis, and the 6 days and the arithmetic. Frank Sinatra listened and then asked what Samuel played, and Samuel said trumpet, and Frank Sinatra said, "How long?" And Samuel said, "Since I was 11, so 26 years." And Frank Sinatra said, "You any good?" And Samuel said good enough to have come to Las Vegas for a job that didn't exist, which was not quite an answer to the question, but which Frank Sinatra found more honest than a direct claim of ability would have been. And Frank Sinatra said, "That's not the same thing." And Samuel said, "I know, I am good. I wouldn't have come if I wasn't." And Frank Sinatra said, "Where are you staying?" And Samuel named the motel on Fremont Street, and Frank Sinatra said, "Stay here tonight, I'll arrange a room." And Samuel said, "I can't accept that." And Frank Sinatra said, "It's a hotel, not a charity. The room is going to be empty regardless of whether you're in it. What I'm actually asking is whether you can be back here tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon." And Samuel said, "Why?" And Frank Sinatra said, "Because I want to hear you play before I decide whether to do what I'm thinking about doing." And Samuel looked at Frank Sinatra with the expression of someone assessing whether what they are hearing is real, and then said, 2 o'clock. And Frank Sinatra said, 2 o'clock, and stood up and walked away from the bar toward the casino management offices to arrange the room. And Samuel Bridges sat at the bar for another 10 minutes looking at his untouched bourbon, before picking it up and drinking it in one long swallow. The room Frank Sinatra arranged was not extravagant, but it was clean and comfortable, and it was at the Sands rather than a motel on Fremont Street. And Samuel moved into it that night with his single bag and his trumpet case, and lay on the bed for a long time in the dark, trying to determine whether what had happened at the bar was actually what it appeared to be, and concluding that he would know by 2 o'clock the following afternoon. What happened at 2 o'clock was that Frank Sinatra came to one of the hotel's smaller rehearsal rooms where Samuel was waiting with his trumpet, and Frank Sinatra sat in a chair against the wall and said, "Play something you think is the best thing you can do." And Samuel stood in the center of the rehearsal room and played a Miles Davis piece that he had been working on for 3 years, and that he knew represented the highest level he had reached. Played it with the complete attention of someone who understands that this is an audition that matters. And when he finished, Frank Sinatra was quiet for a moment and then said, "Play it again differently." And Samuel played it again with a different approach, more spare, and Frank Sinatra said, "That's the better version." And Samuel said, "I know, I'm trying to decide whether I believe that." And Frank Sinatra said, "When you're deciding, stop playing. When you've decided, the decision is in the horn." Which was the kind of observation that a person only made if they had spent enough time inside their own relationship with performing to understand what the difference felt like. And Samuel nodded and played the passage again, and this time the decision was in it. And Frank Sinatra said, "Yes," and stood up and said that he was going to make a call, and that Samuel should wait. And Samuel waited in the rehearsal room for 25 minutes while Frank Sinatra made the call. And when Frank Sinatra came back, he said that there was a musician in Las Vegas named Hector James who led a small group that performed at a venue on the other end of the strip, and who was looking for a trumpet player, and who Frank Sinatra had called, and who was willing to hear Samuel play that evening at 6 o'clock if Samuel was interested. And Samuel said, "Why would you do this?" And Frank Sinatra said, "Because the alternative is you go back to Memphis and teach elementary school, which is not a bad thing to do, but it's not the right thing if you can do what you just did in this room." And Samuel said, "You don't know me." And Frank Sinatra said, "I know what you sound like when you stop deciding and just play, which is the relevant information." And Samuel was quiet for a moment and then said, 6 o'clock. And Frank Sinatra said, 6 o'clock. Ask for Hector James, use my name, and left. Samuel Bridges played for Hector James at 6 o'clock that evening and was offered the trumpet position with Hector's group before the audition was finished. Offered it in the particular way that musicians offer positions to other musicians when the audition has rendered further deliberation unnecessary. And Samuel accepted and called the elementary school in Memphis the following morning to arrange a leave of absence rather than a resignation, because he was not yet certain enough of the future to burn that particular bridge completely. And he remained in Las Vegas for 2 years playing with Hector James's group, before moving to New York, where he worked as a session musician for the remainder of his professional career. And the leave of absence from the elementary school eventually became a resignation when it became clear that Samuel was not returning to Memphis. Frank Sinatra saw Samuel Bridges one more time after the day of the audition, which was a brief exchange in the Sands lobby 6 weeks later when Samuel had come to the hotel to leave a note for Frank Sinatra. A handwritten note on plain hotel stationery thanking Frank Sinatra for what he had done and saying that the position with Hector James had led to work that was leading to further work, and that Samuel wanted Frank Sinatra to know that the evening at the bar had changed the arithmetic. And Frank Sinatra had encountered Samuel in the lobby as Samuel was leaving after dropping off the note with the front desk, and Frank Sinatra had said the note was unnecessary, and Samuel had said, "I know, but I needed to write it," and Frank Sinatra had said, "The playing was good, that's why it worked. The playing was always going to work. It just needed to be in front of the right person." And Samuel had said, "That's the thing about the right person, isn't it? You never know if you're going to find one." And Frank Sinatra had said, "You don't find them, they find you. You just have to be playing when they walk by." And they had shaken hands, and Samuel had walked out of the Sands into the Las Vegas afternoon, and Frank Sinatra had gone back to whatever the afternoon required of him, and neither man had spoken to or about the other publicly. The event settling into the private category of things that had happened and been resolved, and did not require further discussion. And Las Vegas in the spring of 1961 continued its nightly performance of light and noise, and the specific American promise that somewhere in this city your circumstances could change if the right combination of events assembled itself in the right order, which was mostly an illusion but was sometimes, rarely and without announcement, the plain truth.